Are you feeling the squeeze? Many Americans are. Grocery prices have soared, credit card debt has topped $1.3 trillion, and over 60% of us are living paycheck to paycheck. This isn't just a statistic, it's the reality for families across the nation balancing on a financial knife's edge. The hard truth is that not all states are prepared for the next economic shock. Some are dangerously exposed due to bad policies, unaffordable housing, and failing infrastructure. While the average American home price soars past $420,000, incomes lag far behind, creating an unsustainable gap. When the next downturn arrives, certain states won't just bend, they'll break. Today, we're identifying the 10 states most likely to collapse first. You need to know if your state is on this critical list. 10. The Pacific Northwest's Progressive Paradise Paradox. Oregon presents itself as a forward-thinking utopia, a green haven of innovation and social progress. From the trendy streets of Portland to the stunning natural beauty of its coastline and forests, the state projects an image of prosperity and idyllic living. However, beneath this carefully curated veneer, a precarious economic foundation is showing deep and alarming fractures. The story told by gleaming cityscapes is starkly contrasted by a different, more troubling reality unfolding on the ground. A landscape of shuttered small businesses, a pervasive homelessness crisis that has overwhelmed city services, and a crime rate that has residents and entrepreneurs on edge. This isn't a future problem. It's a present-day crisis threatening to unravel the state's social and economic fabric. The state's financial architecture is dangerously dependent on high-income earners and the volatile technology sector. This reliance creates a boom-and-bust cycle that leaves public finances exceptionally vulnerable. When the national economy thrives and the tech market soars, tax revenues flow generously into state coffers. But when the inevitable market correction or downturn occurs, that revenue stream doesn't just slow, it evaporates almost overnight. Projections already indicate a staggering $1.8 billion budget shortfall by 2025, a deficit that is likely to deepen as businesses, weary of a complex regulatory environment and high taxes, continue to seek more favorable climates elsewhere. The flight of these businesses not only erodes the tax base, but also eliminates the very jobs that sustain the middle class. Between 2019 and 2024, property crime in Portland surged by nearly 30%, creating an atmosphere of instability that has proven toxic for the small businesses that are the lifeblood of local economies. This has a direct impact on sales tax revenue, further straining a budget already stretched to its limits. Adding to the pressure, Oregon has become one of the nation's least affordable states for renters, with median rents in cities like Portland climbing to $1,700, a figure completely misaligned with stagnant local wages. Unsurprisingly, migration data reveals a significant outflow of residents, who are trading the Pacific Northwest for the more affordable and economically stable landscapes of Idaho and Utah. This exodus of working families and young professionals represents a critical brain drain and a shrinking base of taxpayers. The state's infrastructure tells another story of neglect and decay. Federal reports classify half of Oregon's highways as being in poor or mediocre condition, a clear sign of systemic underinvestment. This crumbling infrastructure not only poses a safety risk, but also acts as a brake on economic activity, making it harder and more expensive to transport goods and for people to get to work. When you combine this decay with a volatile tax structure, a shrinking middle class, and a political leadership that proposes multi-billion-dollar solutions for problems without a clear funding source, you have the perfect recipe for a systemic collapse. The state's social programs, already buckling under the strain of a severe housing crisis and a devastating addiction epidemic, are simply not equipped to handle the shock of a major recession. The demand for services will skyrocket precisely as the funding disappears. For Oregon, the progressive dream is on a collision course with economic reality, and when the next downturn hits, the state is positioned not just to stumble, but to fall over the edge of a cliff it has been approaching for years. New Mexico, with its breathtaking red rock canyons, vibrant cultural heritage, and the artistic allure of cities like Santa Fe, projects an image of timeless beauty and mystique. This postcard-perfect facade, however, conceals a deeply troubled economy that is fraying at the seam. The state's economic resilience is not just weak, it's practically non-existent, propped up by a few volatile industries and significant federal aid. This dependency creates a fragile system where a downturn in one sector or a change in federal policy could trigger a catastrophic collapse. The statistics paint a grim picture that stands in stark contrast to the enchanting landscapes. New Mexico consistently ranks near the bottom for economic health, and a closer look reveals a state on life support. A key indicator of this fragility is the state's workforce participation rate, which languishes at 49th in the nation. With just over 55% of the working-age population either employed or actively seeking work, the numbers suggest a deep-seated economic malaise that borders on resignation. This isn't a temporary dip, it's a chronic condition reflecting a lack of opportunity and a cycle of dependency. The poverty rate stubbornly hovers above 18%, a figure that swells to even more desperate levels in rural counties. In these areas, entire communities are sustained by a precarious combination of federal government transfers and low-wage, seasonal employment. The state's budget itself is a high-stakes gamble, with nearly 40% of its general fund revenue derived from the volatile oil and gas industry. This over-reliance on a commodity market known for its wild price swings is a recipe for fiscal disaster. When global energy demand falters, New Mexico's budget doesn't just get tight, it implodes, threatening funding for every essential service from education to healthcare. The state of its public services further exposes this vulnerability. The healthcare system is in a perpetual state of crisis. Over a quarter of all New Mexicans rely on Medicaid, and vast rural stretches of the state are classified as healthcare deserts, lacking even a single full-time hospital. This forces residents to travel for hours to receive basic medical care, a barrier that often proves insurmountable for the elderly and the poor. The education system is in even worse shape. In 24 for the umpteenth time, a U.S. News & World Report analysis ranked New Mexico's K-12 education system dead last in the nation. Low literacy rates and poor educational outcomes create a feedback loop, fueling a continuous exodus of young, ambitious individuals who leave for better opportunities in neighboring states like Texas and Colorado. This brain drain leaves behind an aging, underemployed population that contributes little to the tax base needed to fund a recovery. With dangerously thin state reserves and no diversified economic engine to fall back on, New Mexico is acutely exposed. When the next recession arrives, it won't be a struggle, it will be a full-blown crisis, likely leading to the shuttering of more rural clinics, further decay in public schools, and an accelerated wave of outmigration that will leave the state hollowed out. The last frontier's great unraveling. Alaska, a state synonymous with rugged individualism, vast wilderness, and immense natural resource wealth, is facing an economic reckoning that threatens its very foundation. The image of a state flush with oil money and breathtaking landscapes is a powerful one, but it masks a chilling reality. Alaska's stability is an illusion built on the dangerously unstable pillars of volatile energy markets and a dwindling population. The state's fiscal health is almost entirely tethered to the price of oil. A staggering 85% of its budget revenue is sourced from oil-related income, including royalties, production taxes, and earnings from its famed permanent fund. This extreme dependency has turned the state budget into a high-risk portfolio. When oil prices are high, the state can afford its extensive government services. When they plummet, Alaska doesn't just face a deficit, it plunges into a full-scale crisis. Despite spending more per capita than any other state in the nation, public services are stretched perilously thin, particularly in the remote communities scattered across its immense territory. The cost of living is astronomical, driven by the state's geographic isolation. Basic necessities that are taken for granted in the lower 48 come at a premium in Alaska. A gallon of milk can easily cost over $10 in rural areas, gasoline prices often soar past $6 per gallon, and exorbitant heating costs consume a huge portion of household incomes during the long, harsh winters. This high cost of living erodes the purchasing power of residents, even those with seemingly high incomes. Compounding this economic pressure is a demographic crisis. For 6 consecutive years, Alaska has experienced a net population decline, losing over 30,000 residents since 2016. This steady exodus of people, often young professionals and families, is a devastating drain on the tax base and the future workforce, leaving behind an older, more dependent population. The state's infrastructure is in a similarly precarious condition. The dramatic impacts of climate change are an immediate and costly threat, with over 100 rural villages facing critical erosion that threatens their very existence. Meanwhile, deferred maintenance on essential roads, ports, and public buildings has created a multi-billion-dollar backlog that the state has no realistic plan to address. Then there is the Permanent Fund Dividend, PFD, the annual payout from oil wealth that was once a cherished symbol of the state's shared prosperity. In recent years, the PFD has become a political battleground, with payouts shrinking dramatically as lawmakers grapple with budget shortfalls. The reduction in the dividend in 2024 sparked widespread anger, serving as a stark reminder to residents that the oil cushion they once relied on is no longer guaranteed. What makes Alaska uniquely vulnerable is its profound lack of economic diversification. There is no burgeoning tech scene, no major manufacturing base, and no tourism boom large enough to compensate for its deep-seated addiction to oil. When the next global economic downturn inevitably sends energy markets tumbling, Alaska's economy will not just wobble, it is poised to shatter under the immense weight of its geographic isolation and its fatal overdependency. 7. The Sunbelt's hollow boom. At first glance, South Carolina appears to be a poster child for the New South's economic revival. The historic charm of Charleston is now complemented by a burgeoning tech scene. Massive new manufacturing plants are announced with great fanfare, and its sun-drenched beaches are a magnet for retirees seeking a warmer, more affordable lifestyle. This narrative of growth, however, is a carefully constructed mirage built upon a fragile and unsustainable economic model. The gleaming factories and luxury coastal developments mask a deep-seated economic vulnerability that threatens to shatter this illusion of prosperity when the next downturn hits. The state's progress is skin-deep, and the foundations are far from secure. A closer look at the numbers reveals a less rosy picture. South Carolina's median household income remains stubbornly low, trailing the national average by nearly $12,000, while approximately 15% of its population lives in poverty. The high-profile industrial investments, particularly in the automotive and aerospace sectors, are often secured through massive corporate subsidy packages. The state has committed billions of dollars in tax breaks and incentives to lure these companies, a strategy that starves essential public services of desperately needed funds. While these factories do create jobs, many are low-wage positions that do little to build broad-based wealth. This approach creates a hollowed-out economy where corporate profits are prioritized over public investment, leaving schools, infrastructure, and healthcare systems chronically underfunded and ill-prepared for a crisis. The long-term consequences of this underinvestment are stark. The state's K-12 education system consistently ranks among the worst in the nation, currently sitting at 40. Per-student spending is significantly below the national average, a policy choice that all but guarantees future generations will lack the skills needed to compete in a modern knowledge-based economy. The healthcare system is another ticking time bomb. By refusing to expand Medicaid, the state has left hundreds of thousands of its most vulnerable citizens without health insurance, placing an immense strain on emergency rooms and charitable clinics. This crisis is particularly acute in rural areas, where hospitals are closing at an alarming rate, creating vast healthcare deserts. Furthermore, South Carolina's maternal mortality rates are among the highest in the developed world, a tragic indicator of a failing system. Add to this the escalating threat of climate change. Coastal cities like Charleston are already experiencing over 70 days of flooding per year, causing billions in property damage and threatening the vital tourism industry. While the influx of retirees may provide a temporary boost to the real estate market, they are not a driver of sustainable economic growth. Instead, they place greater demand on an already overburdened healthcare infrastructure. When the next recession strikes, this fragile model will collapse. Corporate investment will vanish, tourism dollars will dry up, and the state's shallow tax base will be unable to cope with the surge in demand for social services. South Carolina's boom is set to become a bust. 6. The desert mirage of endless growth. Arizona has been aggressively marketed as the land of limitless opportunity and explosive growth, with the Phoenix metropolitan area frequently topping lists of the fastest-growing urban centers in America. People have flocked to the state, drawn by the promise of jobs, sunshine, and an affordable cost of living. But this rapid expansion is not synonymous with genuine prosperity, and Arizona is accelerating toward a brutal collision with reality. The state's entire economic model is built on a foundation of sand, threatened by a housing bubble, a catastrophic water crisis, and the punishing realities of a changing climate. The relentless growth has created a system that is fundamentally unsustainable. The most immediate threat is the state's housing market. Between 2019 and 2023, home prices skyrocketed by an astonishing 70%, creating a classic speculative bubble that is already showing signs of instability. This meteoric rise has completely detached from local economic realities. The median rent in Phoenix now hovers around $1,600 per month, a figure that is crushing for households earning the area's median wage of just under $60,000. This widening gap between housing costs and incomes is a recipe for disaster, pushing homeownership out of reach for working families and creating widespread housing insecurity. However, the most existential threat to Arizona is not financial, but environmental: water. The Colorado River, the lifeblood for over 40% of the state's water supply, is dwindling at a rate that has outpaced even the most pessimistic projection. Drastic cuts have already been implemented, with farmers in agricultural hubs like Pinal County seeing their water deliveries completely severed. This has devastated local farming communities, crippled a key sector of the state's economy, and will inevitably lead to higher food prices for everyone. The specter of climate change looms over every aspect of life in Arizona. The state suffers from one of the highest rates of heat-related deaths in the country, and each summer brings new record-breaking temperatures that place an unbearable strain on hospitals and emergency services. The state's power grid is pushed to its absolute limit during these intense heat waves, making widespread blackouts not a question of if, but when. This entire growth model is predicated on a continuous inflow of new residents. But what happens when the housing bubble pops, the taps run dry, or the climate becomes simply unlivable? The migration patterns could rapidly reverse, causing the state's fragile, consumption-driven economy to snap. Meanwhile, chronic underfunding has left public schools ranked 45th in the nation, producing a workforce that is ill-equipped for the high-tech semiconductor and engineering jobs that politicians love to promise. With minimal state reserves and massive converging crises on the horizon, a housing collapse, a water shortage, and a climate disaster, Arizona is a perfect storm in the making. The desert is reaching its boiling point, and when the national economy falters, Arizona will break. 5. The quiet collapse of the Pine Tree State. Maine does not often make national headlines for economic crises. Its identity is one of quiet coastal towns, rugged forests, and a stoic, independent spirit. Yet, it is often in the quietest places that the loudest warning signs are found. Maine's economy is a study in fragility, characterized by its rural nature, an aging population, and a steady demographic decline that poses an existential threat to its future. This is not a state facing a sudden shock. It is a state undergoing a slow, grinding collapse that a national recession will rapidly accelerate into a terminal freefall. The state's economic structure is its primary vulnerability. With over 55% of its population residing in rural areas, one of the highest rates in the United States, economic opportunities are scarce. This rural concentration translates directly into fewer well-paying jobs, lower household incomes, and a greater reliance on social safety net. The median household income in Maine is approximately $68,000, significantly lower than the average for its New England neighbors. Meanwhile, the cost of living, particularly housing, has surged. Since 2019, housing prices have climbed nearly 40%, a spike that has effectively priced out the younger generation of workers the state so desperately needs to attract and retain. This has created a vicious cycle where a lack of opportunity drives young people away, further weakening the economy and diminishing the tax base. The most critical flaw in Maine's foundation is its demographics. It is one of the oldest states in the nation, with a median age of 45 years. This top-heavy age structure is an economic time bomb. An aging population means a shrinking cohort of working-age adults to generate tax revenue, coupled with a ballooning demand for expensive public services like elder care, Medicaid, and Medicare. The economic pillars that once supported the state have crumbled. The manufacturing sector, once a powerhouse, has largely disappeared. The iconic fishing industry, particularly the lobster trade, is being battered by the combined forces of climate change, which is warming the waters of the Gulf of Maine, stringent regulations, and the pressures of overfishing. Lobster catches, the cultural and economic pride of the state, are already in decline, signaling the end of an era. Compounding these economic woes is a devastating opioid crisis, with overdose deaths continuing to climb, placing immense strain on healthcare and emergency services. The state's infrastructure is also failing. Nearly 15% of its bridges are rated as structurally deficient, and access to reliable rural broadband, a necessity for modern economic participation, lags far behind national standards. When the next recession arrives, it will hit Maine with disproportionate force. The state will face a catastrophic decline in tax revenues, a healthcare system overwhelmed by an aging populace, and an accelerated exodus of its youth. Without a new generation to carry the economic torch, Maine is at risk of becoming a hollowed-out state of retirees dependent on dwindling services, its quiet way of life fading into history. 4. The Sooner State's House of Cards. If one were to search for a state that perfectly encapsulates the concept of a house of cards, Oklahoma would be a prime candidate. Its entire economic structure is precariously balanced on the volatile swings of the energy market, primarily oil and natural gas. This is not a diversified, resilient economy, it is a high-stakes gamble on a single sector. Nearly a quarter of Oklahoma's gross domestic product, GDP, is directly tied to energy production, making the state extraordinarily susceptible to global price shocks that are entirely beyond its control. The memory of 2020 serves as a stark warning. When crude oil prices collapsed, Oklahoma's unemployment rate effectively doubled in what felt like an instant. The fundamental vulnerabilities exposed during that crisis have not been addressed. The state remains just as exposed today as it was then. Beneath the surface of its energy-driven booms, a persistent poverty crisis festers. The statewide poverty rate hovers at a troubling 15%, but this figure masks the much deeper desperation in rural counties where economic opportunity is scarce. The state's fiscal management exacerbates this instability. During energy booms, tax revenues flow freely, and state spending increases accordingly. However, there is a consistent failure to build substantial reserves for the inevitable bust. This short-sighted boom and bust budgeting leaves public services in a perpetual state of jeopardy. The cracks in Oklahoma's foundation are widening into chasms. The state has one of the highest uninsured rates in the nation, with over 14% of its citizens lacking any form of health coverage. This problem is magnified in rural areas, where hospital closures have become commonplace. Since 2010, at least 8 rural hospitals have shut their doors, leaving vast geographic regions without access to emergency medical care and forcing residents to travel for hours for basic treatment. The public education system is in a state of collapse due to chronic neglect and underfunding. Teacher salaries became so uncompetitive that it triggered a mass exodus from the profession. In response, the state has been forced to issue a record number of emergency teaching certifications, placing individuals with minimal or no formal training in classrooms. This is not a strategy for building a future workforce. It is an act of sheer desperation that mortgages the state's future. Adding to these man-made crises are the relentless threats from nature. Oklahoma is situated at the heart of Tornado Alley, where extreme weather events regularly inflict billions of dollars in damages. Furthermore, the state has experienced a dramatic increase in earthquakes, widely linked to the practice of wastewater injection from fracking operations, which destabilizes homes and critical infrastructure. While Oklahoma City may project an image of stability and growth, the reality in the state's small towns is one of decay. Businesses are closing, populations are shrinking, and hope is dwindling. When the next national economic downturn arrives and energy revenues inevitably crater, Oklahoma is primed for a systemic collapse that will see schools close, healthcare deserts expand, and its economic house of cards come crashing down. 3. Big Sky Country's Big Gamble. Montana, the treasure state, evokes powerful images of rugged independence, vast open landscapes under a boundless sky, and a frontier spirit. This romantic mythology, however, obscures a fragile economy that is unraveling under the pressures of demographic challenges, economic volatility, and environmental strain. The very characteristic that defines its appeal, its incredibly low population density, is also a source of profound structural weakness. While it sounds idyllic, this sparsity translates into exceptionally high costs for delivering basic services, a limited diversity of job opportunities, and an infrastructure network that is both weak and expensive to maintain. Montana's economy rests on a precarious three-legged stool: agriculture, tourism, and natural resource extraction. All three of these sectors are highly vulnerable to the whims of global markets and the increasing disruptions caused by climate change. The agricultural backbone of the state is already under severe duress. Persistent and worsening droughts have devastated ranchers and farmers. In 2023, crop yields fell by a staggering 20% below the long-term average, while ranchers were forced to shrink their livestock herds in the face of skyrocketing feed costs and dwindling water supply. The tourism industry, centered around iconic destinations like Glacier and Yellowstone National Parks, appears robust on paper but is notoriously fickle. A single severe wildfire season, a national recession that curbs discretionary travel, or even high gasoline prices can cause the industry to collapse almost overnight, taking with it countless small businesses and seasonal jobs. The economic realities for residents are harsh. The state's median household income is just $67,000, a figure completely out of sync with the cost of living in its popular urban centers. In cities like Bozeman and Missoula, a flood of out-of-state wealth has caused housing prices to explode, doubling between 2015 and 2023. This has created a crisis of affordability that is pushing out lifelong residents and working-class families who can no longer afford to live in their own communities. Access to essential services, particularly healthcare, is dire. Over half of Montana's counties have no hospital equipped with obstetric services, meaning expectant mothers often have to travel for hours to receive critical prenatal and delivery care. This lack of access is a life-threatening reality for many rural families. At the same time, the opioid and methamphetamine crises are tearing through small towns, overwhelming the state's thin law enforcement resources and underfunded public health systems. Perhaps the most critical vulnerability is Montana's deep reliance on the federal government. Nearly 40% of the state's entire budget is financed by federal dollars. In the event of a national economic crash, a key priority for any federal administration will be fiscal austerity, which will inevitably lead to significant cuts in funding to states. With no diversified private sector economy to fall back on, Montana will be left fiscally stranded. The result will be a rapid acceleration of rural collapse, leaving behind empty towns, failing farms, and a state that can no longer afford to sustain its cherished myth of rugged independence. 2. The Green Mountain State's graying future. At first glance, Vermont is the picture of idyllic New England life. It offers a landscape of rolling green hills, a thriving culture of craft breweries and artisanal foods, and the quaint charm of its small towns. But this postcard-perfect scenery conceals a state teetering on the edge of structural collapse, threatened by a demographic crisis that is unparalleled in its severity. The core of Vermont's problem is its size and its age. The state's entire population is a mere 650,000 people, smaller than that of many mid-sized American cities. This creates an incredibly narrow tax base to support all public services, a base that is shrinking and aging at an alarming rate. Vermont has the second oldest median age in the entire nation, at 43.7 years, a clear sign that retirees are beginning to outnumber the working-age population. This demographic imbalance creates a fiscal death spiral. The state is heavily reliant on property taxes to fund its government, but housing affordability is in a state of freefall. Between 2020 and 2024, median home prices shot up by nearly 50%. This surge, combined with a chronic lack of new housing construction, has made it virtually impossible for young families and workers to establish themselves. The result is a continuous brain drain as the next generation flees for more affordable and opportunity-rich states. This leaves behind an older, sicker, and more economically dependent population that places ever-increasing demands on a healthcare system that is itself collapsing. Healthcare costs in Vermont are among the highest in New England, yet access is diminishing, especially in rural areas. It is now common for entire counties to have no practicing OB/GYNs, forcing residents to cross state lines for essential medical care. Vermont's economy is as fragile as its demographics. It leans heavily on tourism and small-scale agriculture, two sectors that are notoriously sensitive to recessionary shocks. The state's renowned ski resorts, a major economic driver, are entirely dependent on high levels of discretionary spending from out-of-state visitors. When a national recession hits and families tighten their belts, tourism revenue evaporates, gutting the state's finances. The agricultural sector is equally precarious. Dairy farming, long a cornerstone of Vermont's identity and economy, has been in a state of terminal decline for years, with more than 200 farms shutting down in the last decade alone. Because Vermont has little industrial base, it is heavily dependent on federal aid to patch its budget and on energy imports to power its homes and businesses. Any disruption to these external lifelines sends costs soaring for its residents. The myth of Vermont's sturdy self-reliance masks a harsh truth. The state is propped up by outside money, from federal transfers to wealthy second home owners. When the U.S. economy crashes and that external support dries up, Vermont will be one of the first to buckle, its small size and aging population offering no buffer against the storm. The one-trick pony of the Northern Plain. The story of North Dakota is a dramatic tale of extremes, and economies built on extremes are the first to break in a crisis. During the shale oil boom of the early 2010s, the state was hailed as America's next economic superpower. The population of oil towns like Williston doubled seemingly overnight, billions of dollars in tax revenue flooded state coffers, and North Dakota proudly boasted the lowest unemployment rate in the nation. It was a period of unprecedented, dizzying growth, but every boom contains the seeds of its own destruction, and North Dakota's single-minded pursuit of oil has left it more economically vulnerable than almost any other state in the Union. Today, it stands as a case study in the dangers of a one-trick pony economy. The state's entire fiscal health is shackled to the global price of oil and gas. Over 50% of all tax revenue collected by the state is directly linked to energy production. This is not a strength, it is a fatal dependency. It means that when global oil prices dip, as they inevitably do, North Dakota's entire budget does not just shrink, it implodes. The 2020 oil price crash provided a terrifying preview. State revenue plummeted by nearly 30% in a single year, forcing drastic cuts to services. The population boom that accompanied the high-paying oil jobs has not only stopped, but has now reversed. As drilling activity fluctuates, transient workers are leaving. The once hot housing market is cooling, and towns that looked like prosperous hubs are shrinking back into obscurity. Many families are now trapped, saddled with large mortgages on homes that are declining in value. Despite the temporary wealth generated by the boom, the state's underlying economic health is poor. The median household income is only around $68,000. Yet the cost of living in the boomtowns soared to levels comparable to major coastal cities, leaving many local families financially strained even before a downturn. The public services needed to support a modern society are crumbling. The rural healthcare system is on life support, with over half of all hospitals in North Dakota operating at a financial loss. Closures are accelerating, leaving vast, sparsely populated regions without timely access to medical care.